Hey, Mr. Murphy here, just going to talk to you about the different types of plants. So we break them into four major groups. We have mosses, ferns, gymnosperms, or maybe you know those as conifers, and angiosperms, which are our flowering plants. So I'm going to take these from sort of the most simplistic to the more complex or advanced. So starting with the mosses, here you see actually this is an angiosperm tree, but it's got moss growing alongside of it. I'm sure that out in parks or near creeks or streams or maybe even in your own yard, you've probably seen mosses before. They grow very low, close to the ground. And a big part of that is because they have no vascular tissue, which means there's no tubes. There's no ability for them to transport water. You know, when we think about plants, oftentimes you're thinking like the roots, which are carrying water up to the leaves or the top part of the plant. In the case of mosses, they simply don't have that type of tissue, and so they can't grow that large. They have to be right up against a surface that has water available nearby because they rely on diffusion and osmosis. So in addition to just being low-lying, we find these in places that have moisture pretty much year-round, which would be near streams or, again, maybe at the base of a large root structure of a tree, as that's probably existing in a place that gets enough rainfall and such if it's sustaining that larger tree. So these tend to be pretty simplistic. Obviously, they're very successful. We find them still all over the planet, and that's mosses. Ferns, you might look at this picture and think, well, that's just kind of like every other plant I've ever seen. And it's true. Ferns have very sort of typical plant look. Their leaf structures are a little different than, you know, a tree you might find in your backyard. But it's got kind of this, you know, bushy look to it. First off, ferns do have tubes. So they have what we call xylem and phloem. And the xylem carries water from the roots up to the leaf structures, right? Because the leaves are up off the ground. The roots are able to capture that water and then carry it up. And then phloem, which carries nutrients typically back down. So the leaf is where you have photosynthesis and different metabolic chemistry happening. So when the water has come up from the roots and is helping those leaves to undergo photosynthesis, they can make the nutrients and things. They can send those nutrients back down. Since the roots don't have any access to sunlight, they can't produce their own food. An interesting thing about ferns, though, is that they don't come from seeds, and they actually reproduce via spores, which is something that, you know, you might think of spores more with like fungi and mushrooms and stuff, but the fern, and this bottom picture shows it, the fern actually produces these spores, and those spores then are released. Those spores then continue to grow and can combine to produce then a new fern plant. So it's kind of gross, it's kind of cool, and it's definitely confusing, but that's something that makes ferns sort of unique amongst these groups. Next up, we have gymnosperms, and this would be sort of like a conifer forest or pine trees, evergreens, those types of trees. They typically have needle-like leaves, which they keep year-round, or they lose and just keep making new ones continuously. Those needle-like leaves are a little bit easier to sort of provide resources to in colder months, so you often find these types of trees in colder areas. They have well-developed vascular tissue. They can grow very tall, so they have xylem and phloem, which work very well to carry water and nutrients. Probably the most interesting thing is that they produce seeds through pine cones, and everybody knows what a pine cone is, but I bet that a lot of you don't really know what a pine cone is. And what I mean by that is, if you think about it long enough, pine cones are actually kind of weird and kind of gross, because the pine cones are actually the reproductive organs of these plants. They sexually reproduce, and so there are actually male and female pine cones, and the male one is shown at the bottom picture here, and that releases the male half of the reproductive combination, which is pollen. And that pollen then gets to the more what you consider a typical pine cone, which is actually the female portion of that. And within that, there's an egg cell that then gets fertilized by that pollen, and then these little shells open up and drop off seeds. So interesting thing about gymnosperms, that they do sexually reproduce. The last one is angiosperms, and these are our flowering plants. Just to be clear, you know, most trees that you find that are not pine trees or, you know, conifers, most trees that you find around our area are angiosperms, even if they don't produce like slap you in the face flowers like the cherry blossom here. These trees do flower in different ways, and sometimes it doesn't quite look like a typical flower, but these trees flower, and that's part of their reproductive process. They definitely have well-developed vascular tissue. California redwoods, I think the tallest one is like 370 some feet tall. So pretty good vascular tissue in order to carry water from the ground up almost 400 feet into the air in order to get it to those top level leaves. They have leaves, which are often lost, seasonally as there's less light in the colder months. It's harder to maintain those leaves, and so they'll often lose them. It kind of depends on where we're talking about. In like a tropical rainforest or something, you don't necessarily have the same cycle of leaves. They produce flowers, and those flowers sometimes just transfer the pollen through wind, or maybe utilize pollinators. And so different types of birds and bees and flies and beetles and other insects or animals will use the flower. Oftentimes they're lured by nectar that the flower produces, so that the flower then transfers pollen onto the animal, which then passes it on to the next flower and can aid in that reproduction. Again, it is sexual reproduction, which is kind of a strange thing to think about with plants. So these are our 4 big groups of plants. Just want to sort of make you familiar with the different types of plants that exist out there and the different accommodations that they have, or adaptations that they have, in order to be successful in their different types of environments. As we move forward, we're going to be really focusing on the energy capture that happens with plants as they undergo photosynthesis by capturing sunlight to make their own food. For each of these different groups, it can be a little bit different, but by understanding a little bit about their structures, we can make pretty good assumptions and pretty good inferences from just, understand a little bit about how these things work, and you can probably piece together how they're going to be able to undergo photosynthesis successfully. So there you go. Hope that was helpful.